Good morning, Comrade. You listen to WHVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is your weekly Good Morning, Comrade. Jeff here, and I also have a very special guest, returning champion. Actually, you were on the show about 3 years ago or something.
I think so. Maybe even more, but yeah, it was a great experience, and I'm really glad to be back.
Welcome back, David Duhalde. How you doing today?
I have been better in terms of the world, but I personally I'm in a good place. Just enjoying the seasonal change. Put my winter coat on for the first time this winter, and just bracing for what was going to be a lovely, lovely Christmas and holiday time in the Big Apple.
There you go. And it was like I actually just flew in this morning from New Orleans and to Richmond, and it just was dank and rainy, and it's like, oh no, not this. Like cold and rainy, but it is what it is. So this is going to be sort of part of a series of interviews that I've sort of been wanting to talk about with people in terms of what comes next after the previous election. What are some even takeaways about what we can expect going forward, and also in the sort of overlying pall of the nightmare of Trump is back again, and Republican trifecta in all three houses in the federal government. There have been you kind of don't want to bury the fact that there are many state and local elections and races that that were run by working people and that were literally huge victories. One of the ones that I mentioned to you was Kenya Gibson in Richmond, District 3, actually my district in Richmond. She was just won her race to be the city council member, and also in New Orleans, Gabriela Biro, and these are just two off the top of my head. Gabriela Biro, who was locally supported by the DSA chapter there in New Orleans, my old chapter, she made the runoff for School Board District 2 out there. We actually have if you're listening now, last week, you would have heard an interview with me and her, just sort of going at it for an hour. So it was really, there are some positive takeaways, but I guess maybe taking stock of, the whole situation, what are your sort of thoughts, basically coming from, the outcome of this election and then sort of looking forward?
Yeah, I think you can look at it the way I do, and the way I've been thinking about it in preparation for writing kind of a longer form piece for DSA's Democratic Left. So I'm kind of looking forward and looking back. So I'll break it down into first what you were talking about with the work with, I think of the local work is going to be incredibly important, and then I'll talk more about kind of where I see the history of democratic socialists and broadly leftists in these kind of different transitions in the White House. I fully agree about the importance of local kind of resistance. And what is very telling to me is that while Washington is a trifecta, it's actually a very weak trifecta in the House, which in some ways is actually not worse, but it's a different bad. And by that I mean it's while some of these folks won't be around, like Matt Gaetz, he resigned anyway, whether he gets confirmed or not, we'll see. I think he probably will, but he's resigned. But you have these and Speaker Johnson's done a pretty good job of controlling the far right. But now they have you have to realize their far right is in certain ways. Well, I'll never say they're like DSA, but some of these people are true believers, and some of these people actually represent kind of the gadfly, I don't care about committees. They're I'm just here to
Mess stuff up.
Yeah, spread the good word, mess stuff up is kind of the same thing for them. So they're going to be like the right wing no longer has the excuse of, I'd love to pass that, but the Democratic Senate's going to stop us, and Joe Biden will just veto it. Now they're going to be like, why not put Fauci in jail? Why not round up people? So it's going to just I think it's going to be incredibly chaotic and uninspiring for
Mm-hmm.
broad swaths of people we want to move to, because one thing that really the burden that is different on the center to left and the right is we have to make people think government works and that ultimately people we have to especially as socialists we're while we distrust kind of the state, we ultimately do need a functioning government, and I'm distinguishing between state as in who controls the power and just the government as in public services.
Mm-hmm.
um because ultimately we're trying to create a democratic society that'll have a high functioning democratically controlled government. So we're there just it let's just kick people off snap. I don't care if they're Republicans.
Yeah,
they're
they have the sort of vandals advantage. They kind of have if they
totally.
smash a window, they don't really have to worry about fixing it.
No, they don't, and it vindicates their worldview because you want to have a government that doesn't function well to then justify getting rid of it.
Or, or
Um,
they want a government that is going to give money to millionaires and billionaires and
exactly.
corporations. It
Yeah,
takes away rights from people.
yeah, and I always bring up when I talk about government, when I've had to interact with the government, the more the program affects middle class or rich people, shockingly the better it's run. I had to get a social security card, took
Mm-hmm.
5 minutes. I had to get Obamacare, it took a little longer. Had to get unemployment.
Yeah,
It's no, it's who cares about you? You figure out your own problems.
I'm dealing with that right now.
Yeah, it's
It's
really
horrible.
tough, and and it shows you who interacts with the state. But we're going back to what's more inspiring. It's so I'm part of my work is I'm the chair of the DSA fund. So the DSA fund for listeners is a legally distinct nonprofit from the Democratic Social America. We're a 501c3. We just have one staffer, whereas DSA has 15. We're not a chapter-based organization. We're just an educational nonprofit. And one of our jewels is this program called How We Win, which is inspired by a lot of great work that other progressives have done on the local level, specifically use that word intentionally because local progress, which is a municipal network of lefty and progressive politicians. And the idea is to create a space in which people can share ideas, share best practices. And one of the things that we gained from local progress, the insight they gave us was we're not going to be an ALEC. ALEC is a very specific thing. I'm not going to repeat what I said before, but
They have
basically
billions of dollars in
yeah,
Alec. We
billions of
don't have
dollars,
that
but also, but even we had billions of dollars, their job is just to create bills that
model.
destroy
Yeah,
the state. We have to
model
create
legislation.
bills that help people. And the problem with federalism is a bill that could help people get free buses in New York City doesn't look the same as New Orleans because it's just different funding mechanisms. Different the cities are different. The states. It's you can't just replicate these things because the governments just without politics, just because the governments function differently. So it's been a really important network. So we had a great conference a couple of weeks ago in Philadelphia just for Northeast electeds. And it just was great to see people sharing ideas. And then since the election, we had a call last week just with a national call with about 24 electeds and their staff to talk about local resistance. And I think people are very wise that the way we're gonna, because I just was juxtaposing it, Washington D.C. is gonna be a disaster. So you're gonna to inspire people because we can already mobilize people. They're there to be Trump is bad. You see
Mm-hmm.
DSA immediately join the calls the Trump is to stand against his agenda. What we do still need people give people hope. You can't just be everything sucks.
There's a lot. There's a lot of doom,
Yeah,
in
and that's
people's
dangerous. It's yeah, you need people to be clear eyed, but you also then don't need them to be demobilized.
yeah.
And so what I see is a lot of people are talking about dealing with the police and so by police I'm specifically talking about police budgets. How do you frame um winning issues to because defund has been there's a lot of pushback to defund, but there's also a lot of pragmatic stuff. So one person brought up I'll respect their confidence, so I won't say who it was, but I'm not going to steal valor. It wasn't my idea, but I hadn't thought about it, which is he's if you ever think about it, Amazon used to be relying on USPS to subsidize its mail. Now it does its own thing. But what it can't do is like can't provide security. So like police are being like drained
Mhm.
trying to figure out missing packages, thieves. It's like, well, you know what? Are we? Is it your taxpayer dollars, which is a loaded term, but it's like, is it the public coffer should be like subsidizing an industry because people don't want to go to a store and buy it? It's like from non-union labor. No, like
Yeah.
you need to like so people. He's like, there's other ways we can explain like an anti-carceral message that is actually like incredibly pragmatic and
Mhm.
like really talks about resources and like why we shouldn't be subsidizing these corporations. And it was like a really, and it kind of blew my mind because it was like a very simple but like anti, carceral state, anti-capitalist, but incredibly pragmatic and like I won't say mainstream because I also think it's loaded, but it was definitely a majoritarian. It was like something
Mhm.
that you didn't have to be ideological, even if the idea itself came from an ideological place
Mhm.
to buy into. So I think that when you were talking about some of the electeds, and we saw, and then one of the other people who came up was like another new elected from a red state, because those
Mhm.
people are really kind of the petri dishes for like, okay, how do you build local inspiration, not just resistance, but local inspiration, and some of it is also just like, you know, calling the police out, but also calling out other electeds who are not in the statewide electeds who are not doing their things, and people like being the kind of beachhead, being the person who speaks truth to power, and people respect that, and I think that is going to be a huge part too
Mhm.
of this, but ultimately it's really going to be about connecting people on a local level to pass things to like, and there's going to be a lot of pushback, like already Mayor Adams in New York City has been talking about getting rid of the sanctuary city, so that's like going to be a major fight right there, that we're going
Mhm.
to have to deal with. And I think what the last thing I'll say too is like, and I try not to be too political about New York City, so I'm just going to say things that are broadly true, because that's something he's doing. Is like one thing I really like about when I'm seeing like candidates like Zoran Mamdani from New York City's mayor race is like that while I would not going to can't donate to anyone because of my job, can't endorse,
Mhm.
but he's like talking about economic, free buses, and I think that forces also a lot of leftists because it's very easy to be like Trump's doing a lot of horrible foreign policy stuff. We'll continue what Biden is doing, if not make it, and definitely make it worse. That's really important. We have to be there in that fight, but
Mhm.
we also have to speak as someone who canvassed for 4 days in Pennsylvania. People's perceptions of the economy are warped,
Oh yeah.
and so like if we're not speaking to those issues, like it's in one ear out the other.
Well, and that was one of the key issues for like when the Harris campaign, their entire thing was they basically offered an empty hand or more like instead of offering anything in the hand, they were pointing a finger and being like, "You don't want that guy, but don't look at us if you want anything." And I mean that very clearly went over like a lead balloon when it came to the election. We need to sort of like start pushing for working class candidates that are essentially that have ideas for how to actually benefit working people, and that's sort of like a part of it. I know that like and when it comes to specifically electeds, I know especially among leftists for some reason AOC is controversial. I know that she takes some positions that like leftists don't always like. Some of the disagreements or whatever I agree with, but the others I don't. But you don't see that many, elected officials like that standing at a picket line, handing out sandwiches, and encouraging those workers that are out there. And I lived in the first district in Louisiana. I lived where Steve Scalise is from. He's just as likely to be on the side with the cops as he is.
It's like the
So it's
devil
like
mirror image of AOC.
yeah, it's just like yeah, you're just looking at Satan. But like it really does make a difference when it comes to sort of st- at least starting points, and like I mentioned earlier, a couple of these smaller offices are places to build from and to begin rallying people around. Labor organizing, things like that, just have to be like the steps forward, one foot in front of the other, and just kind of move from where we're at. And there's going to be a lot of crazy stuff going on at the federal level, and we just have to keep our heads down and just move forward to where
Mhm.
about on the things that we can actually like change.
Yeah. So what are you seeing like in where I'm just curious about what kind of local resistance and like
Mhm.
ways that people are responding to Trump where you're at.
So I know that they had. I was in New Orleans for the week. I just got back here today, so I can talk a little bit about New Orleans. There was
Yeah,
definitely like they had they definitely had a couple of actions, sort of like just show up and sort of I guess just put up the flag and say we'll not stand for this kind of things. Um, and then because it's New Orleans, there was also a jazz funeral for democracy, which is a little cringe, but it's very New Orleans.
yeah.
It's like one of those.
It's allowed in New Orleans.
Yeah,
Anywhere
yeah,
anywhere
only
else I feel
only
like
New Orleans. You listen to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade, goodmorningcomrade.com. And sort of like, again, on that front of looking forward, and you and I are both
yeah
DSA members, and part of the organization. One of the things that I sort of think about, and especially compared to the last time,
yeah. I
you
want to
know,
talk about that.
when when there was definitely a significant bump in membership, and there was not very much infrastructure in place. I lived in New Orleans. There was no
Words out of my
chapter,
mouth.
and there was no chapter in New Orleans when that took place. So in terms of like starting points, we were definitely like starting from brick one in terms of building. Um, what do you think in terms of like considering that there is infrastructure here now? What would you say? I guess would be ways to sort of, since we're I guess a little bit more prepared for
Hmm.
if there is a membership bump, or if there is sort of like a little bit of an organ, an organ here to do some fight back. Where do you think that starts, and how do you think it should proceed?
Yeah.
Just sort of in your opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll promise I'll answer your question, but I do want to go look a little back, even further back than
Mhm.
that,
Sure.
because it's been fresh on my mind as I was mentioning in my opening part, and then I didn't get to it. So I appreciate you bringing it back. I joined DSA like 20 years ago and change. So my first presidential election, that I voted in, that I was a DSA member, was showing my age, was John Kerry
Yeah,
versus George Bush, and I
you're
think
about
what
the
was
same age as me,
okay,
right?
solidarity, man. Yeah. Not of not a lot of the DSA members would know
Yeah,
what I'm talking about.
we got more gray in our beard than the rest of them
Yeah,
kids.
well, like, so they'll learn other ones.
They'll get there.
And what I was reflecting on when I'm writing this piece for the Democratic left was that so totally different DSA, very small, about 5,000 people. For context, YDSA, the youth wing that I was in had like 6 or 8 chapters. Like, I mean, there's probably that many chapters in New York City. There's
Yeah.
really small. The organization backs John Kerry, but and it was really part of like the anti-Bush Popular Front that was like kind of similar, but
Mhm,
for reasons I'll get into, different than what we saw in 2016 and 2020 with Trump. But what
mhm,
what you saw like then was like no growth, and I think there was 2 reasons that I credit that for. One was like the organization's weak, so it's not like attractive to go into,
mhm.
and two was that like out of that primary, for those who remember, like there was Democracy for America for the Howard Dean campaign, and then Progressive Democrats.
Ah!
Yeah, and my man Dennis Kucinich, who
Oh,
has gone a
yeah.
different direction, but was like the guy I supported back then. They created Progressive Democrats. So a lot of
Mhm,
the liberal left people who might have been like, I'm looking for like an R Revolution or a DSA in 2016, like went into those, made sense.
mhm,
And then the groups like the International Social Organization, which doesn't exist, also DFA doesn't exist anymore either.
mhm,
Where it's just more dynamic. So people like
mhm,
had these like either like these new shiny things to go to from like the right, and
mhm.
quote unquote, and then from the left there are also new and shiny things too. So DSA, like, we were kind of like looked around. I look back now, I can look at it and be like, we started like at the finish line. It was like we
Mhm.
like after all that work, like we didn't gain anything. And so I think why am I telling you this boring story from 20 years ago? Is that I think like what I think is really important to remember, even though I'm not like one of those militant like don't endorse the Democrat person, there's
Mhm,
actually not inherently like there's not automatically what people need to recognize like a benefit to endorsing the presidential candidate. Like it
mhm,
was like we endorsed Obama too in '08. Like we didn't endorse anyone until Sanders, but like
mhm,
it's like you don't you need there has to be, to use a fancy word, there has to be the zeitgeist has to be in your favor. There has to be like broader wins.
mhm,
So I also sometimes don't think not endorsing or being anti helps. It's just like, but I think that's more important to put out. But
I think the role is to provide. I mean, the importance of the role is to provide guidance, at least
exactly.
in
And
terms
so
of
you're
like.
never, yeah, what guidance we were doing. And I think a
Mhm,
microcosm of that you bring up was like, we used to, when I was in the youth wing, we used to like pass these activist agendas, which at one point I was like the boy with like in the Emperor Has No Clothes who was like, why are we passing these 50-page? It was like literally 50, let's say 50 point items, and like we're an organization of 6 chapters. Like, why don't we just focus on one thing? Like, it's like, and it's like sometimes you just need to be like, let's narrow it down.
Yeah.
But
Take a
DSA
deep
did
breath.
get, then we fast forward through Occupy, through the beginning of BLM, the Great Recession. So DSA does start picking up steam. By 2016, though, when I'm on staff as the deputy director, and you folks like many folks like you are joining, I think one of the key difference then was like besides the infrastructure being starting to get better was the planning. Like we like, and I brought this up in my like celebration of Maria Savart, the former national director, when she left. And
Hmm.
I talked about like things we did and she led, and it was like really building. And this key thing, which I bring up all the time when people let me, is like what we didn't have then in 2004, which we were against, but was true, was Citizens United. So back
Hmm.
then, like all the money went into these like anti-Bush things, but not pro-John Kerry things, and like so then they would disappear, and
Hmm.
like groups like DSA were very limited in what they could spend money on. Citizens United, like as long as we didn't coordinate with Bernie Sanders, which we didn't because like, he wasn't going to coordinate with us anyway. He had his own campaign to run. You could just do whatever you want. So we like created this independent expenditure that allowed people to do a lot of work as DSA, but for Bernie and totally like in complementing what his campaign is doing. And then you're
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to relate to these like different formations, like the People's Summit, which people may not remember, but that was like the National Nurses United would put these on, so to bring together like all the Bernie groups to meet, like pollinate ideas, meet,
Hmm.
like build relationships, to like which were really important for the next few years. So we didn't have the infrastructure. You're right, and I think the lesson I draw from that, especially in like the piece I'm writing, is like what's really critical in this moment, which I'm seeing people do, so it's a good compliment, but it's like you got to give people concrete tasks. So
Hmm.
like what at least for us, someone with and I remember New Orleans specifically because I remember New Orleans there were like we were had this dynamic growth from being like 2 dozen chapters to like overnight
Hundreds.
hundreds, and so like in New Orleans was like this interesting case of like these separate groups of people started the
Yeah.
organizing committee process, and then we had to be like, can you guys work together? And you guys did, and it was great, and also kind of made me have faith, being like, no, people are like will work together. It's just a unique moment that like it's
Hmm.
just so bonkers busy. But the task then was like start a chapter, like figure out things to do, and then what was and then you would have these like fights that people have like that I was reliving on some Twitter battles I was seeing recently about like Medicare for all versus disability working group kind of fights. But they're always like, should we do mutual aid? Should we do these? It was like the brake light clinics, which were these
Hmm.
efforts to help people fix their brake lights.
Oh
So
yeah.
like it was like Chairman Mao's like let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like people were just like throwing things to the wall, seeing what would stick. And I think that was like a really special time that we can't get back. And I'm actually like
Hmm.
very like look fondly on it in terms of like it was a very small D democratic period of like here's what there's an activity if you want people there's like a mass of people you got to sell it to them to like
Hmm.
to get to go because it wasn't like and I think that was like and what what I remember specifically doing was like when I because I was a staffer so I was a little different than what I understand I'm asking other people to do but like
Hmm.
yeah, I was based in I was the only staffer based in DC. Everyone else at the time was in New York. Now they're more spread out. We had the a women's march coming. We had inauguration coming. So we had all these new people show up to a meeting, and I was like, "Who wants to help me plan? Like, be on the planning committee for this?" And it was like, and there was some of the old guard came, but it was basically 90% new people. Like, and people you would know from like, from who are still active. And I give that example because it was like people needed something concrete to do. And like the advice, if I have one piece of advice for the listeners today, it's like it's okay to be like, here's what we're doing. Do you want to join? If you could maybe because it should be today should be thinking about you should be thinking about capacity building. What's that project you never got around to doing? What's
Hmm.
the project you just need a few more hands to make better? Like people don't need a like, what do you want to do? Because they already know what they want to do. They want to fight Trump. They want to build like the leftist movement. So it's
Yeah.
giving them so like that inauguration committee, while it was like very short term because the inauguration happened, the women's march happened, it helped people build their confidence. It helped people like build relations with the other people on the committee
Hmm.
it helped them like really commit to the organization and stay. And so that's so so right now what we have is like and I think there's an important political and why I brought up those other groups. in 2016 too, it's like you and I also met through like groups like Our Revolution, but there was
Hmm.
also Indivisible, and there was all these other like random things coming up, and I
And we
was
met at we met at Netroots too.
exactly right, yeah. And I remember like I had to joke recently. I was like, "Do you remember when Justice Democrats had chapters? Pepperidge Farm remembers." Like it was a different time. Like, and so Justice Democrats, to their credit, was like, "Look, we're going to be better as like a SWAT team coming in, no chapters." Those kind of so things have kind of sorted out, and like the market, I hate to use this term, but it's true. I'll use it in a tongue-in-cheek way. The market has decided, so groups have kind of picked their lanes, and DSA, is actually in a really great position, more than I think I gave it credit for until this moment, where I saw like 3,000 people have joined in the past week, which is about actually what more or less happened. I'm gonna double check the numbers 'cause we did some research back then, but it was like about the same. I mean, but there's like but the difference is there's infrastructure to take people in. You see these meetings with. I went to the New York meeting after the election. There's like people are handing out slips of like, what do you want to volunteer on this campaign? Do you want to join this thing? It's like those kind of some of those key fights are over, and people can plug people in. So I'm like, this is where I'm like going to be like the Pollyannish glass is three-quarter full. Like the national picture stinks, but actually groups like DSA are like in a really good position to mobilize people because I think we've gone through these growing pains, and it's an exciting time. And I don't think like, for example, that call I'm talking. I mean, even like the stuff DSA Fund is doing, like one staffer, like
Hmm.
DSA couldn't have gotten 20 electeds on a call, like
No,
to talk about. I
not
mean, like in
not
20,
8 years ago.
no, not yet. It was like it would have been like I remember the last thing, and I'll turn it back to you because but I remember like talking about the People Summit. I remember when like this state rep from Massachusetts was like, "I'm interested," and we were like, "Oh, style, like hold my calls,
Hmm.
everyone. I got to talk to the state rep." It's like now it's like now
Now
it's
it's
like now it's like
regular.
the state reps are like handing out flyers at the meetings. Like
Yeah.
it's just a different organization, and that's like I think sometimes we should take stock and be like,
I,
wow,
re-
we've actually achieved a lot.
I remember when Jabari Brisport was just a guy, like he was just a member.
Yeah,
But yeah, a Pepperidge Farm remembers, I guess.
yeah.
But yeah, no, that's like one of the things that like people I guess take for granted when they sort of when I mean, if you just look back now
Hmm.
and you look back, I mean, again, you mentioned the years prior to 2016, and that's all like that was really great backstory. But if you even just look back those 8 years, I mean, the growth and the articulation of an organization like DSA has been monumental. I mean, there were campaigns we ran a presidential campaign 4 years ago for Bernie. Obviously, it didn't go the way we wanted it to, but it definitely was something, and it was something that like move things forward. And that is, in spite of, people who only engage with DSA through Twitter and just see people, sometimes members of the NBC, posting the dumbest stuff you've ever read and seen and fighting and screaming and all these other things. So it's just, it's just, there's always pains in the road. There's bumps in the road on the way through there. But we are, it feels at least, as an organization moving in the right direction. And one of the things I guess I did want to sort of talk to you about too. So, and I'm speaking of this from specifically like a New Orleans slash Virginia perspective. One of the things that I have kind of noticed is that there's a lot of attention and focus on local issues, and there's a lot of like hand wringing, I guess you could say, more than anything about national issues. And when it comes to like statewide legislature things, I guess maybe it varies by state. But like, there's no sort of, I mean, I guess some states do have statewide formations and things like that. Have you really thought about like how that could play out, or how that sort of like level of articulation could be a coordinating base for like statewide campaigns and move things forward? Because I've definitely, I mean, I've been on two different states coordinating committees for these, and it seems like I'm bashing my head against the wall sometimes trying to get people on the same page just to even like make a thing exist.
Yeah, I mean, look, so now we've talked about the great stuff. Let's talk about like what still needs to be done. And I think
Mhm.
so. Like, as someone who's been to like many DSA conventions of old, it's like the fascinating dynamic of like I'm sure there's like the prisoner's dilemma, or there's some term for it, but it's like everyone agrees, and that's why we have the Democracy Commission now to figure out the structure. is like everyone agreed the DSA structure didn't make sense, but
Hmm.
no one wanted to be the one to vote for the other guy's
Yeah,
idea.
because of
And
the
I
politics, the
yeah, and
political
I
disagreements,
remember
and
even
the.
like having like I was at the 2019 convention. I was just talking to some people from other factions at lunch, and like it was like such a different conversation than what was happening on Twitter or on the campaign floor. People were like more like, because people were just honest, like, yes, this doesn't like this is my
You're actually
like,
having a conversation
yeah,
with a
actually having a
human
conversation.
breathing next to
Yeah,
you.
yeah, and I think what I've always, but then like to get to your point, and not just like reminisce about these one-offs, is like what doesn't make sense, but what people agree that doesn't make sense is like, and let's like look labor movement as an example, because DSA actually, what people I think sometimes forget is like DSA is kind of structured like a union, like it's like
Hmm.
the chapters actually are technically called locals in the
Hmm.
Constitution. But what doesn't make sense is that there it's like you have like all these locals and an international. Whereas
Hmm.
like any union would have like locals, then there's like the state council, or then there's like a joint council. Like there are these like intermediate bodies that DSA just doesn't have. So it's like, which makes conversations really hard because you have like 90, let's say 70,000 members who are in
Hmm.
200, 250 chapters or whatever, and then there's 16 members of the the national
Yeah,
leadership
you
plus
have
I guess
you have a
co-chairs.
local, you have a national organization, and you have a million miles in between the
Yeah,
two.
it's yeah, and so I think like moving towards, so like California's been a good model of this, like moving towards like a real state federation. And it's like, but the big barrier there, like let's look at New York. New York, I mean, New York City DSA is basically 10% of the membership.
Yeah,
How do you
of
figure
the
out it
entire organization.
of the entire organization? Yeah, so it's
Hmm.
like, how do you have like, do they have a state council where they have one vote with like the smaller chapters? They probably don't want that, you know. And so it's like you have to figure out democratic ways. And I remember this was like an interesting debate in our revolution, where what our revolution did was our revolution had 4 state committees that they funded in the beginning, and because the debate was either do you do all state committees or you just do chapters. So like why don't they try? And they tried this method, which more or less showed like I think you could kind of do it if there was like money involved. And I think ultimately that's what like would
Yeah.
probably solve the problem is like you would have DSA would have to commit like, or the state cause themselves would have to fundraise like New York City does, like hire a staffer who is like managed by like a board by the state chapters, because ultimately getting back to your what we've been talking about, the overarching thing is like
Hmm.
it is possible still, not in Washington, but even in like red states to like pass statewide or stop
Hmm.
bad legislation, like, or
Hmm.
water it down, like, but you need a DSA that can like operate, or an R revolution that can operate on a statewide thing, on a statewide level.
Hmm.
And there was no way to pass like the Building Public Renewables Act, getting that in the budget, without like a statewide plan that involved downstate,
Hmm.
upstate members, like in New York State, to like get this like very pro-environmental thing that they couldn't really pass on its own, but like could get what they could get. They could bully the establishment into putting into the budget, which then got it passed in then got it passed like in the bill, in the omnibus bill. You know, that's possible, but it is difficult, and I think that it'll require like some serious hard conversations about like resources, about like democratic processes, because in the end it is undemocratic. It would be undemocratic to have like a senate for like these states where like chapters are at varying sizes, but you also don't want something where it's like the mega chapter is like just runs roughshod
Yeah.
over everyone. And I think these are like the hard democratic choices that we have to make. But ultimately, I think it will be made for us, because
Hmm.
and what we saw at the How We Win is I think a key part of this, which we haven't talked about, is like
Hmm.
the Socialist in Office Committee. So like New York is a very developed one, but
Before we
another
get to that, before we get to that Socialist and Office Committee, can I just pause really quick for station ID? You're listening to 102.3 WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. Jeff Barawa here with David Duhalde. I'm so sorry for interrupting you, but you were talking about the Socialist and Office Committee.
yeah, and I'll speak a little slower, and then I'll get back to you. But like Socialist in Office committees are really important bodies that that aren't the chapter leadership, that coordinate like the public policy efforts of the DSA chapters. So it's like the elected leadership, so the socialist office holders, the DSA elected leadership, other people who are appointed, who work together to kind of push things through. So it could be like it could be a bill. So I remember like there was like an example in like your state. I remember I think it was Charlottesville. We did a presentation where they like got some like renters. It was something to protect, like it was a renters or eviction defense,
Hmm.
and it was like that was like an effort by the chapter with the city council comrades on council. Like those kind of coordinations are really key. But then how do you get that? But then how do you scale it up to the state level? It's going to require like those bodies working together.
Hmm.
So I'm hopeful, but it's like it is really the next frontier for DSA to mature as an organization.
Hmm. Yeah. One of the things that I have sort of seen popping up as well, post the election, I suppose, maybe that's been going on prior, but they've just been getting put on my radar. Are these organizing fairs? Are you familiar with these?
I've heard about them. You want to talk a little bit about them more?
I was actually going to ask you about them, but
I
it
can talk
seems,
about them.
yeah, yeah. I'm not super familiar. I just sort of have talked with. I had a conversation with my buddy Jack, multiple time guest on this show, Jack Reno Sweeney in New Orleans. We had drinks last night, and he said they had one in New Orleans coming on in February, I believe it was, and they have others that have other chapters that I've spoken to that have these things popping up. Can you describe what these things are, and maybe just sort of like give a little background and why they might be useful?
Yeah. So to my understanding, though, I think you and I will confess, I'm not as familiar as I could be. But I think speaking back to my earlier reference to like
Mm-hmm.
the very small d democratic process of figuring
Mm-hmm.
out what DSA was and its chapters were going to focus on in the months after Trump's election and his inauguration. I think
Mm-hmm.
when I got to the point that I think some of those conversations have settled is because like what has happened in the 8 years, which have been stressful, hard, but really important struggles of like creating committees,
Mm-hmm.
seeing what are the long term projects that people are interested in, what just like died off and no one cared about.
Mm-hmm.
And that like you have like a DSA that in some ways I bring up is like a coalition. And I say that
Mm-hmm.
in the total just descriptive sense. And that like it is the caucus, which I don't want to get too much on the caucuses, but you have caucuses, but you also have these like subcommittees that like have a lot of independence, like do a lot, like drive a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the work on their own. And so the key thing is just like what I was saying is like we don't want to be an organization. That's why I think these organizing fairs, as I understand them, are really
Mm-hmm.
great. We don't want to be like the college kids that I was once was like. We go to the new students at the club fair, and you're like, "What do you want to do?" And the person's like,
Yeah.
"Not talk to you. I want to like, no, you don't know what you're doing."
Yeah.
Um, so these fairs like present like different projects that people are working on. They help
Mm-hmm.
explain what are ways you could plug in as a member, what are the expectations, and it's really great because it's like if you are like a new person or a re-engaged person, like you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You just want to like
You want to get to work.
you want to get to work, and I think it gives people like a democratic choice. And I think this has always been, not to go on a tangent, but I think it's a fascinating because we've been talking a lot about democracy in this call. Is there's always this fascinating tension of like even removing like the heavy like conversations about democratic centralists versus like wishy-washy.
All the
It's
stuff
like
that normal people don't
I have
care
no
about.
idea, but ultimately the conversation is how much of DSA should be controlled by people voting with their feet. It's a
Mm-hmm.
real conversation because like you want to have like us vote on things and people have to commit to them. But in the end, what I say is like the biggest democratic checks on DSA is like you could like let's say you guilt tripped everyone at your chapter into passing a resolution that oh you got to feed my puppy once a week,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone's like I don't want to vote against the puppy resolution, but
Yeah.
you can't make people actually feed the puppy. Like people, and
Mm-hmm.
that's I think what sometimes like gets lost in these fights about like passing stuff is like if people don't want to do it, they're not going to do it, and
Yeah.
like nothing can really pass without because I think because people know like in the end they don't want to embarrass themselves by passing something that no one will do, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's like what's so great about these fairs, and that's ultimately what's so great about the projects that come out of DSA is because like they do get sorted out, and by that I mean like the ones that really can attract people and hold them like succeed and like and last, and the ones that don't because it's like it is a democratic organization, not just in voting and in form, but also in essence, and that people can like pick and
Mm-hmm.
choose how their level of involvement, and I think that's
Yeah.
important.
And you mentioned earlier, like much earlier, I actually did want to circle back to the break light clinics
Hmm.
that we did, and things like mutual aid. I know that there's a national mutual aid working group, there's a electoral working group, there's an international working group, but When it comes to the mutual aid things, one of the things that I found about it, and there was a lot of discussion that went around about the sort of like the role of it in the organization or whatever. One of the things in New Orleans that I found that it was very very useful for was it was a very easy first project to get people involved in and get people to lead on that would grow their experience so that they can move on to some little more complicated things, I suppose. And that's key too when you're bringing somebody in. Part of the sort of onboarding process, I think, is getting people experience doing some kind of work, because if they've never done anything before and they just show up to a meeting and people are just like looking around talking at each other or whatever, they're not going to come back because it's not meaningful.
No, I totally agree, and I think it was always really. I'm trying to think of the right polite word to say it, but like I would just say people who came from my wing of DSA could be very anti-mutual aid, and I was
Yeah.
always like not. And I didn't really fully understand some of the oppositions. I think I didn't understand the
It
level
felt
of
like it was just trying to make a point,
yeah,
You're
it
just
wasn't
trying to make a
understand the
point.
level of opposition, but like if you want to be charitable, you could say, and, pun intended, like they were like, well, we're not a charity. Why should we be doing charitable work?
Hmm.
And I would, so I'm not going to repeat what you said, which I think is incredibly true about like
Hmm.
it's also a way to like give people a concrete way to help and like
Hmm.
build their confidence. But I'd also bring up like going back to like my earlier point about like that we need government to function. The
Hmm.
other underlying thing, which as I've gotten older, I've noticed is like you can have a government that functions, but if there's no social trust,
Yeah.
you can't have socialism either. And like that's like
Dude.
something we actually don't talk about a lot because it's like not that important to like
Hmm.
in our broad class struggle. But like if people don't trust their neighbors, they're not going to have solidarity with their neighbors. Going even beyond like
Yeah.
any of the bigotry, if they just like don't trust them, and like mutual aid's very important to like showing like
Yeah.
breaking down these things that often you would happen in churches or something where you could build a community showing like you can trust your neighbors, you can trust
Yeah.
people are actually just good people who aren't like trying to pull a fast one on you. And that's why I've always been like why I'm secretly very like not secretly, I'm openly very soft on mutual aid, even if I don't do
Yeah.
it myself, because I think like we live in a horrible capitalist society that's like, very atomized, individualized, and like just having people doing good deeds like
Hmm.
is really important. And also people who are doing it not because they're like religious group is like
Yeah.
pushing them to do it to convert you, which is like a lot. Honestly, a lot of like that good.
That's very Protestant.
It's very Protestant, but it's like, and it's interesting, like when you meet like Protestant groups who are doing that, it's ultimately because their ulterior motive is like you want to convert people, which
Yeah.
is their ideological and theological bent. And for us, it's like our ulterior motive, you even called that being so negative, but it's like, but it's to like build trust, to like
No
build a
social
better
trust.
world, which
Yes.
is like very different than being like than having like a countdown of like how many people
Yeah.
are having a not a
How
countdown,
many sales did you
how many
make in
how many
the in
sales did you
the?
make? Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that like, and it's hard to, and I think what would hurt mutual aid too was that like it's an almost impossible thing to measure. Like, can you measure
Yeah.
like happiness? Can you measure like people whose lives like you
Hmm.
don't we're not like doing a long longitudinal study on people who didn't get arrested, and
Yeah.
like but like the people who could do it on, it's not exactly mutual aid, but I think it's worth shouting out like the stomp out slumlords, who are like they would do the in DC they would do, and I think it got replicated in a few places. They would like do research on who was facing eviction, go to their doors, knock on them, like help them walk through, and then they track that data to show that there was a difference in who they
Hmm.
touched. But it's like, and it's not like we should be like data bros, like closing down everything as, but it is like what hurt because like for the thing about what makes elections ultimately easier to plug people into is like one, that's how people think about politics in the United States. They think about just elections, and two, it's like did you win? Did you lose? Did you come close? Like it's easy. People like it. Just it has all these advantages to be easier to understand than
Hmm.
like even labor. And I always say like one of the hard things, like I'm on union release right now, but that
Hmm.
still means I'm a member. Um, it's like, but how do I measure the 4 years I've done like union work making my union better? I mean, there are ways I could do it. I can like talk about it and I can show
Hmm.
you different things, but it's a much the trade union fight is so long and it's
Hmm.
not you
Never ending, some would
it's
say.
never ending and it's like
Hmm.
whereas opposed to election cycles an election cycle. So it's like it doesn't mean like mutual aid and labor they're very worthwhile projects, but they're much harder to measure
They're very different projects.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then but I think the advantage that labor has is because we're socialists. It's like has this like it's so central to the socialist project, so it doesn't have the same kind of like. I don't think there was never going to get the same pushback. Even you could be like, well, what have you done in the past 4 years? Well, we built unions. I'd be like,
Yeah.
yay.
Yeah, we did it. And I want to circle back to labor in a minute, but I
Yeah.
wanted to hit one more point on the sort of like the brake light thing and mutual aid a little bit more generally. But like New Orleans still does brake light clinics. One point I've noticed in Richmond, I live in Richmond now. They apparently like did not. And this is not the only place, but like they've like taken like improper kit as like localities have taken improper kit off their list of like moving violations, which
Hmm.
is I think a tangible thing that like is some growth that we have seen. And then two, like in New Orleans, it's also grown into like various other events. So like it's almost like a weekly or monthly rather deal where we get out there, we change the brake lights or whatever, but then we started doing like health clinics. So we would like provide like health like blood pressure and health information. We like one of our members is a doctor. Like he's a really like awesome, like he's the best. Shout out to Ali. um but like that he would definitely like bottom line these sorts of deals. And then even now I mentioned Gabriella Bureau. They're going to be launching canvases from the brake light clinic on the next one that they have, like right before her runoff election, which like that is such a good idea. Like that's such a great idea in terms of like you get to show somebody out there doing work, and then you also get to see that like literally doing work in the community, and then you also get to like get people out knocking doors for that person. So there's a very direct connection to the work that person is doing in the community, and it would be kind of awesome if we could see more of our elected or candidates doing that kind of stuff. Just like as an idea, I thought that was brilliant.
I like that.
Yeah. You listen to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade, goodmorningcomrade.com. Jeff here with David Duhalde. And yeah, I did want to circle back to labor because I think that it is worth taking stock what sort of like I know it's going to be different with every locality, every chapter. And gosh, I don't have no idea what the labor struggle is going to look like with the Trump coming for the NLRB's neck, and also for many of the stronger labor unions. But sort of taking stock of like what the sort of like role that DSA and organizations like DSA have in the labor movement. What are some ways that we can sort of like think about what I guess like, what are we doing right? What can we maybe start looking at doing going forward? I mean, obviously connecting to and showing support and solidarity for like the stand-up strike last year, or I know there was a lot of preparation when it came to the Teamsters UPS strike, and that ended up not happening. But there was a lot of scaling up on our end. Um, I just sort of wanted to sort of throw it out there and sort of pick your brain on a lot of the labor work that has happened and sort of some possibilities of what can happen going
Yeah,
forward.
that's a great kickoff because
Mm-hmm.
it's something I think about every day because I
Yeah.
work for my so now I report to my union every
Mm-hmm.
day, and I think about like what's my role as a DSA here, what's my role just as a trade unionist, what's my role as a union member. And it makes me reflect on too, like going back 25 years now almost, like there's been a big shift in DSA. There when I was a young person, I can say that now. The
Back in my day.
back in my day, you people in DSA and what's called Young Democratic Socialists of America really pushed us to become union staffers. The idea was like the best way for you to serve labor is like become an organizer or get like a staff job and like be like a really good union bureaucrat. I mean, in like not a pejorative way, but like
No, no, no.
where it's like
Yeah. Be a part
where
of the structure.
yeah, be a part of the structure, like because there are bad union bureaucrats, so it wasn't like
Yeah.
totally illogical. There are people who like it's just a job to them and they have no like, then they don't care. But it shifted to like really pushing, especially young people, but in general to like getting people to get like union jobs or form unions at their jobs, and really be like the rank and file, like leading. And I think that is like they're very different strategies. And without even putting a judgment on one.
They're not mutually exclusive. I
They
do
aren't
want to do
mutually
that.
exclusive either. Yes, they are mutually exclusive. Though some people act like
Some
they are
people,
very
yeah.
strongly.
Oh my god,
And
that drives me nuts.
I can imagine drives me nuts too. Especially because sometimes it's the people who are union staffers
Mhm.
telling you how horrible it is to be a union staffer. I'm
Yeah,
like, interesting.
yeah. Tell me
But
more.
that's a separate conversation. But I think that like what DSA has been really good at though is like, but I think there's a real value in like getting people to become organizers as workers, not just organizers as a job. And by that I mean it's not just like you're on like staff and like you're like it's like and I think I'll just use my personal experience. Like I was
Mhm,
an SAIU organizer. I learned a lot, but it was really hard. And in the end, what I look back on is like I wasn't a hospital worker, and I was talking to hospital workers. And I personally, just I statement, I'm not saying all
sure, sure.
SAU organizers were like this. I just didn't have the confidence to like talk to workers who are not like who because I didn't have their job. Now
Mhm,
that I've been a union member for 4 years, talking to other members of my union, I'm also older, so
mhm,
I understand that part. But it's like different. Like I can be like much more like I know what they're going through because I was like I have the same. I'm a city worker. They're a city worker. It's like I can speak with much more confidence,
mhm.
push back much more.
It's your wheelhouse a little
Yeah, it's
bit.
put so it's like it's different. And I appreciate what I'm trying to say is like well I didn't come from the rank and file strategy from before. Like I actually do appreciate like how it's like it is like better for me. I feel like I'm a better trade unionist being like no because I came through the rank and file. I can like talk
Mhm,
to the members. I can push them. They can push me. It's different than being like um but I still think there's a value for like hiring people to do this
mhm,
work. I think that what DSA needs to grapple with, which I don't think it's grappled with really well, is like how do you organize to change the conditions to organize? And
mhm,
I feel that there was way too people were way too dismissive of Biden's NLRB, and it would be like, I mean, there's always the cranks who are like, and people nothing will be good enough, but I really feel like
the master's tools or whatever.
yeah,
They're the
yeah.
ones that say the
But
same thing all the time.
but it's like Starbucks organizing would not have been possible without the Biden NLRB. Like you would
Yeah.
have had organizing, but the Biden NLRB really provided the legal rules that made it possible. Otherwise, you would have had to have like 1,000 contracts at 1,000 stores. Like it's just not.
Mhm,
It's like, and I think that's like something we need to grapple with coming with the Trump administration is going to make it worse, and it's going to be
mhm,
harder. And I think that DS and I don't. I like, for example, I'm like, I'll be the pessimist here. Like, I understand why Sean Fain of the auto workers is like, let's get all our contracts in line. I get that. I think it's like a nice idea. I think, but there are even if like a union means well, it's hard to like
mhm,
change. Like, and I think like, and I bring up when I bring up the city unions. Like, our contracts expire, but the city just doesn't negotiate with us, and for years. And so you have these like expired contracts, and there's no way, especially small unions like mine, we don't. There's no political possibility to move that up. So
mhm,
it's like you can't just say like we're going to do it. Like you can, an idealist might say that, but in practically speaking,
mhm,
it's like not going to happen, and the membership isn't going to necessarily push for it either. It would take a huge shift. So I think that because I'm very curious because you come from labor too, what you're thinking about
mhm.
this moment. But I really
Well,
think that DSA still needs to be like teaching people how to talk to their coworkers, to form
mhm.
unions,
Yes.
like what Ewok does, to pushing people to make it better, and to recognize also that we need to be like we can't just be so flippant to be like it's only workers who are changing the conditions because that's not true. It's
Mhm.
like it is the laws.
Policy. Yeah.
It is not just like union leadership. And I think something with Eric Blanc, who's one of the big labor guys in DSA, where he and I agree, we're like, you could switch some of the business union leaders with us, and there'd probably still be a lot of problems
Yeah.
because these are actually like as leftists and materialists and in the spirit of Marx are saying like
Mhm,
there are structural barriers. You could put progressive and socialists in charge of unions, and things would be better, but they wouldn't be as better, I think, as people think
mhm,
they would be. And it's not because it's not us. It's that there are structures in place that make it really hard to organize
mhm,
in this country, and it's just not. And that's not going to change just who's in charge of the union. It's who's running it's who's running the state, as I said. Who's running, what power corporations have,
Mm-hmm.
to influence. Those are really important questions too that we need to like be more honest. I think that's my like criticism and like
Yeah, there is a lot of like starry-eyed stuff that I realize within DSA. A lot of sort of like doctrinaire, sort of like if we have all of the power in this sort of situation, and like that is, I mean, in a I guess very technical sense true, but like when it comes to the rubber actually hitting the road, it's not true. My background, I mean, I was a union member for 8 years. I was a school teacher in Jefferson Parish, former executive board. I was on the Central Labor Council of the Greater New Orleans AFL-CIO. Went to like 2 conventions and stuff like that. And one of the things that I did realize is that one of the sort of bridges that needs to be, and this is just talking about the labor thing. I'm not exactly even thinking about how like DSA can intervene here, and we only have about 4 minutes left. But like one of the things that I noticed was there was and this is just maybe a general labor problem. There was a very sort of like difficult relationship between membership and staff and leadership because of, I guess it was like low expectations by the leadership and the staff, and also some predetermined sort of thoughts on like the role of the union and sort of like a sort of kind of a soft anti-unionism, like a minute for the insurance or whatever, and trying to find ways to get people engaged and get people plugged in a sustained effort was really, really difficult. So, I mean, my perspective is the things that we do need to be doing, like you mentioned with EWOC before, we need first off, like organizations like DSA probably should have some kind of an idea of who is a member of a union, which unions are that organization, which unions are they sort of connected with, and sort of like looking at that whole situation and moving from there. Does that make sense? Just sort of like you can make priority based off of capacity that already exists, and then you can also make decisions on like you can look at the where your membership also works, find out where there's potential crossover, and start those initial convening meetings for new workplace organizing. That's sort of
no,
my thought.
no, totally. And I would add to that, like I got a lot out of like meeting some of the, because DSA tracks some of that in New York, meeting some of the other OSA members with my union who are in DSA. That's it's kind of confusing, but the other thing I'd bring up too is like there's sometimes a very oh, what can labor teach us? Sometimes I think people
A
forget
lot.
what can we teach, but there's also what can we teach labor,
Yeah.
and what I was really valuable in my union was there was an opposition slate came about, and I was asked to be on what we in DSA would call the credentials committee. But it was like the election committee. It was the
Yeah.
independent body, and I was the only one, because I'd been in DSA of everyone who had been in a volunteer organization that held elections on a regular basis, and it was
That's a lot to
really.
offer.
And I was like, and it was really important. I mean, it was like I'm not just shooting my horn, because I said like anyone in DSA would have been in the same role. Where like
Mm-hmm.
it was just someone to be like, here's what we do here. Here's like what's a political problem. Here's like a bureaucratic solution. And it was like, and I think like so sometimes we don't have to be so humble. We should also just think like
Mm-hmm.
unions can be very bureaucratic, as you're saying, not moving institutions. And DSA has the dynamism of like democracy, people fighting, and like bring that energy to your workshop. I mean, to your
Yeah.
job.
Yeah. So, David Duhalde, we are going to have to continue this conversation because I feel like we're just touching on the labor stuff, and there's a lot there. But we are running out of time. Where can
Thank you
people
for
find
having
you?
me.
Yeah, of course, man. Anytime. Where can people find you? And yeah, I don't know,
Well, I'm not
shouting out.
jumping ship on X just yet, aka Twitter, which I'll always
Uh-huh.
call it. But so for now, you can find me there at the Dualde. So that's and then DUHALDE. Always looking for a follow. I'll follow back if you say you caught me from Good Morning Comrade. Thank you,
All
Jeff.
right. Thanks, man. Appreciate you coming on as always. And you're listening to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. We love you. Bye bye.